She had orders to destroy me. Then I whispered the words from her wedding night. Jack Ryder's boots thudded softly against the cold, steel floor of the abandoned station. The air was stale, filled with the faint hum of machinery long past its prime. As he moved, every step seemed to echo louder than the last, each footfall a reminder that he was not alone. He had been here before, years ago, before the war had taken everything from him. Now the station was a forgotten relic, barely remembered by those who had once inhabited it. His mission had brought him here, deep into Zaltrax-controlled space, far from the safety of Earth and the company of his fellow soldiers. The orders were clear: infiltrate, gather intelligence, and escape. Simple enough for a man who had survived worse. But now, as Jack crouched in the dim light of the station's control room, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. His equipment was malfunctioning. His communications were down, and his last contact had gone silent. No backup, no rescue, just him alone in the heart of enemy territory. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, a steady rhythm, purposeful and unrelenting. Jack's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to hide, to disappear into the shadows, but he knew it was too late. His position had been compromised. He swore under his breath. He had been careful, too careful maybe, but that was the nature of this war. One mistake and you were dead. No second chances. Jack pressed himself against the wall, his hand tight around the grip of his weapon. He couldn't afford to get caught. Not now, not when he was so close. The mission had to come first. It always had to come first. The footsteps grew louder. He could hear the soft clink of armor and the slow, measured breath of someone who had mastered the art of moving without a sound. Whoever was coming knew how to fight, knew how to kill. And then, from the corner of his eye, Jack saw her. She stood at the far end of the corridor, her silhouette barely visible in the low light. He didn't need to see her face to know who she was. He had seen her before, years ago, under very different circumstances. The Zaltrax officer, the one who had haunted his memories. The one who had been ordered to destroy him. Zelira, his breath caught in his throat. She hadn't changed much. Her uniform still bore the insignia of her people, the Zaltrax Empire's brutal military force, and her movements were as precise and deadly as ever. He could see the coldness in her stance, the way she surveyed the surroundings with a predator's eye. She was here to finish what they had started. Jack's mind raced, calculating the best course of action. He could try to fight her. He was good, maybe even better than most soldiers, but Zelira wasn't just any enemy. She was more than a warrior. She was a force unto herself, a woman with a past tied to his own. A past he hadn't fully understood even then. There was a time long ago when he had been standing in her shoes. They had been together. A distant memory, a lifetime ago, but one that still lingered like a shadow over everything Jack did. And now, fate had brought them together again. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But there she was, standing in front of him. He couldn't run, and he couldn't hide. It was time to face what was inevitable. Zelira's gaze shifted, scanning the room with the precision of a hunter. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she noticed the faintest movement in the shadows. The instinct to survive, to outsmart her opponent, kicked in. Without hesitation, she drew her weapon, a sleek, deadly blade that gleamed in the dim light of the station. Jack knew that weapon well. He had seen it in action. A single strike was all it would take to end his life. But he wasn't going to let that happen, not without a fight. His mind clicked into gear, his training taking over. He couldn't afford to let her know he was here for anything more than a mission. He couldn't let her see the man he once was, the man she had once known. That would only complicate things. But as he moved, ready to strike, something stopped him. Something in the way she carried herself, something in the way she moved. It was as though she were waiting for something. Jack's eyes flicked to her face, and for a split second he saw it. A flash of recognition hidden beneath the cold mask of a soldier. She knew who he was. She had to. And just like that, everything froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as though time had stopped entirely. Jack's mind screamed for action, but his body wouldn't respond. He was caught in a moment that didn't make sense, a moment that shouldn't exist. And then, just when Jack thought he might lose control, she spoke. "Jack Ryder," she said, her voice low but steady. It was a name that should have been forgotten, but it was. She remembered him. She remembered everything. "Zelira," Jack replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was because he had nothing left to lose, or maybe it was because, deep down, he had always known that this was how it would end. Her eyes softened for the briefest of moments. It was just a flicker, like a star fading out of existence, but Jack saw it. He saw the recognition, the connection, the history between them. It was there, and it wasn't something that could be ignored. Zelira lowered her weapon slightly, her expression shifting from one of cold calculation to something Jack couldn't quite read. She wasn't here to kill him, not yet. There was something else on her mind. "I should kill you," she said, her voice tinged with a bitterness that Jack hadn't heard in years. "It's my duty." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had heard them before when they had stood on opposite sides, when they had been forced into a war neither of them wanted. But things were different now. They had to be. "I know," Jack replied. "But you won't." Zelira's eyes narrowed again, her grip tightening on her blade. "You think I'm weak?" "No," Jack said, taking a step closer. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the connection he couldn't shake. "I think you're human." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning neither of them could fully understand. For a moment, it seemed as though everything might explode, everything might come crashing down. But then, to Jack's surprise, Zelira did something he never expected. She smiled. It was fleeting, barely perceptible, but it was there. And in that brief moment, Jack realized that he was no longer facing the same woman he had once known. She was something different now. Something far more dangerous. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't his enemy anymore. Jack didn't know what to expect from this encounter, but it certainly wasn't what had just happened. For a moment, he had thought he might die right here on this forsaken station, at the hands of a woman he once knew as his betrothed. Yet here they were, standing face to face, neither of them sure of what came next. Zelira didn't lower her blade. Her eyes never wavered from Jack, the cold glint in them as sharp as the weapon in her hand. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to choke on. But there was something else beneath that cold exterior, a flicker of something Jack couldn't place. She finally broke the silence, her voice low, almost regretful. "I don't understand why you're still alive." Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with something else, something more personal. Jack's gaze softened for just a moment. "Maybe it's not just you who doesn't understand," he replied, his words coming slower now. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the words seemed to hang between them like a bridge, fragile but there nonetheless. She stared at him, her hand tightening on the weapon. But she didn't strike, and for the first time since he'd seen her, Jack saw something flicker in her eyes, a hesitation that had never been there before. Zelira seemed to struggle with herself, shifting her weight as if wrestling with an unseen force inside her. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered, her voice more to herself than to him. "This is a war, you should be dead." "I should be," Jack agreed, "but I'm not." He stepped a little closer, though he knew better than to get too close. Zelira might not have struck yet, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "Why are you still here, Zelira? You could have finished me when you had the chance." Her gaze flickered briefly to the ground, as though she were searching for something she had lost. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice quieter now. "You don't know what they've done to me, what they've turned me into." Jack's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She clenched her jaw and looked away. "I was chosen, you were just a casualty of war. We were never meant to meet again. It was all planned, Jack, everything." She hesitated, her voice almost trembling with emotion. "I had orders to destroy you, to wipe out every trace of your people, and I followed them." Jack took a step back, his mind reeling. He had always known war had a way of twisting people into something unrecognizable, but this was something else. Zelira wasn't just a soldier anymore, she was a victim of her own fate, of her own choices. His mind flashed back to their wedding day, the day he had disappeared. He had no idea then what had truly happened to her, to them. "Did you ever want this, Zelira?" Jack asked softly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't meant to put there. "Did you ever want to be a part of this war, to be the weapon they made you?" She closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the thoughts racing through her head. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to become what they made me. I was forced to choose sides. I didn't want to. But I had to survive." Jack's heart ached. He could hear the vulnerability in her voice, the cracks in the facade she had carefully built. For so long, Zelira had been a symbol of everything Jack had hated about the Zaltrax, ruthless, cold, and unyielding. But now, standing before him, she was no longer just the enemy. She was a woman, one who had been shaped and broken by forces beyond her control. He wanted to reach out to her, but the weight of the moment held him back. The war had torn them apart, and no matter how much they might want to pretend otherwise, they could never be the people they had been. But there was still something there, something Jack couldn't ignore. "Then why didn't you destroy me when you had the chance?" he asked quietly. "Why are you hesitating now?" Zelira looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else. "I don't know," she whispered. I don't know." The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of the station's failing power systems. Jack felt his heart beat louder in his chest, the need to know, to understand, overwhelming him. "Zelira, tell me the truth. What happened? What did they do to you?" For a long moment she said nothing, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They took everything from me, Jack. My past, my future, my choices. They erased it all. They made me a weapon, just like they made everyone else. And when I was chosen to lead the hunt for you, it was all I had left." Jack's breath caught in his throat. "You were never just a weapon, Zelira. You were always more than that. We were—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't say it. Don't make this harder than it already is." Jack stood there, torn. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between what she had become and what she had once been. It was as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to fall or to climb back to the life she had lost. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he dared to close the distance between them. "You don't have to follow them anymore. You don't have to be their weapon. You still have a choice." Zelira's eyes flickered to his hand, then to his face. There was a moment of hesitation, a fragile thread of trust that neither of them had expected to find. Slowly, she lowered her weapon, her fingers loosening their grip. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jack," she said softly. "I don't even know if I can trust myself." "You don't have to trust me," Jack said. "Just trust that you have a choice. There's always a choice." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. For the first time since their paths had crossed again, she seemed to search his face, not for a threat, but for something real. And for a moment, Jack saw the woman she had once been, the woman he had known and loved. She wasn't the cold, calculating soldier in front of him. She was someone else, someone who had been lost, just like he had been. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this." Jack reached out slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile moment between them. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they could ever go back to the way things were, but for the first time in years he felt like there was hope. "We can start over," he said quietly. "We can figure this out, together." Zelira took a deep breath, her shoulders tense as if she were preparing for a battle she had already fought 1,000 times. But then, in a move that surprised both of them, she stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. For the briefest of moments, everything felt like it might be okay. Maybe they could find a way out of this nightmare together. But deep inside, Jack knew the real war was just beginning. The moments following Zelira's hesitant gesture were filled with silence. The weight of what had just passed between them seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. Jack could feel the tension in her every breath, the internal battle she was fighting. She had lowered her weapon, but that didn't mean she had fully let go of the past. It didn't mean that everything she had been told, everything she had done, would simply disappear. Jack couldn't blame her for that. He had his own ghosts, his own weight to carry. But this was something different. She wasn't just the enemy anymore. She wasn't just a soldier following orders. Zelira was a person, a woman caught in the crossfire of forces far greater than the two of them. She was still the same woman he had once known, and yet everything had changed. "You're making a mistake," she said suddenly, her voice breaking through the silence. "You think I can just walk away from all of this? You think I can just leave it all behind?" Jack looked at her, his expression soft but determined. "No, I don't think it's that simple." "But you don't have to do this anymore. You don't have to be what they made you." Zelira's eyes hardened again, the momentary vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "You don't know what it's like to be forced into a life like this, to be molded into something you never wanted to be. Every day, they remind me of what I've done, of what I've become." Jack felt a pang of empathy. He knew all too well the cost of war, the things people were forced to do in its name. He had seen the toll it took on men and women, both soldiers and civilians. He had been fighting for so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like to believe in something other than survival. "I don't have to understand," Jack said quietly, his voice steady. "But I know what it's like to be stuck, to feel like there's no way out." But there is always a way out, Zelira. You just have to choose it. She stared at him for a long time, her gaze searching his face as if trying to find something she had lost. Maybe she was looking for the man she had once known, the one who had promised to always choose her. Maybe she was looking for a sign that she could trust him again. But Jack wasn't sure if she would ever be able to do that. Trust wasn't something that could be easily rebuilt, not after everything they had been through. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice raw with emotion. "Why don't you hate me? Why aren't you angry?" Jack took a deep breath. "I don't hate you, Zelira, I never did." Her eyes narrowed, her face a mixture of disbelief and something else, a hint of something deep and unresolved. "But I was going to kill you. I was sent to kill you, and I would have if you hadn't—" "I know," Jack interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "I know what you were ordered to do. I know the choices you had to make. But I also know that you're not that person. You're more than your orders, more than what they've turned you into." For the briefest moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of hope, or maybe just a flash of the woman she used to be. But just as quickly it vanished, replaced by the cold mask she had worn for so long. "I don't know if I can ever be that person again," she whispered, looking away. "I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again." Jack stepped closer, his voice softening. "You don't have to trust anyone right now, not even me. But you can trust that there's a chance for something else, something different." Zelira was quiet for a long time. She didn't move, didn't speak. Jack stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched her. He didn't know what was going through her mind, but he could feel the weight of her indecision pressing down on them both. She had been broken by the war. She had been torn apart by her duty, but there was still a chance for healing, a chance for redemption. Zelira finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not who you think I am, Jack. I'm not the woman you once knew." Jack didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He knew that. She wasn't that person anymore. But that didn't mean she couldn't be something else, something better. "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm not the man I was either. We've both changed, but we're still here, still breathing, still alive, and that means there's still a chance." Zelira's expression softened slightly, but she still seemed conflicted. Her eyes met his again, this time with something closer to understanding. "And what happens now?" she asked. Jack didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held for them or if they could ever be the people they once were, but there was one thing he was certain of. "Now we figure it out," he said, "one step at a time." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The station was silent, its dying lights flickering above them as they stood there. Two people who had once been strangers, now brought together by fate, by war, and by something deeper that neither of them could fully comprehend. But before they could say anything more, the shrill sound of an alarm pierced the stillness. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was an emergency signal, loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. Zelira's hand instinctively went to her side, her fingers brushing the hilt of her weapon. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice urgent. Jack's mind raced. The emergency signal could only mean one thing: the Zaltrax were here. He turned quickly to face Zelira, his eyes locking onto hers. "We don't have time," he said, his voice sharp. "We need to move now." Zelira didn't hesitate. She nodded once, her decision made. Whatever was happening, whatever conflict lay ahead, they would face it together. For the first time in years, Jack felt like they were on the same side. And that feeling, that small spark of hope, was enough to push him forward. As they rushed down the corridor, the sounds of approaching footsteps grew louder. Jack knew they didn't have much time before the Zaltrax forces would reach them. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running alone. They would face whatever came next together. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the abandoned station, growing louder with every step. The emergency alarm continued to blare, sending a harsh rhythm through the cold metal walls. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he and Zelira hurried down the narrow corridors, the dim lights overhead flickering erratically. Every corner they turned seemed to bring them closer to danger, the unmistakable feeling of being hunted creeping into his mind. Zelira moved with a precision Jack had not seen in a long time, her body flowing effortlessly through the maze of hallways. Despite her uncertainty, despite the emotional turmoil they had just faced, she was still the soldier she had been trained to be. It was as if the moment the alarm had sounded, her focus had snapped back into place, and she was no longer the woman caught between past and present. She was once again the warrior, the enemy he had once been sent to destroy. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, his voice tight with urgency. He had no plan. His mind was still spinning from the conversation they had just had. How could he focus on survival when everything about this mission had changed? Zalira glanced over her shoulder at him, her eyes hard and focused. "We need to reach the outer docking bay," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It's the only place we can get out of here." Jack nodded, pushing his doubts aside. He didn't have time to question her decisions now. If she knew how to get them out, then he would follow. But the uneasy feeling in his gut didn't go away. The Zaltrax forces were closing in and they were running out of time. As they rounded another corner, they nearly collided with a group of Zaltrax soldiers. The surprise in their faces was short-lived as they immediately raised their weapons, their cold eyes locking onto Jack and Zalira. Jack didn't hesitate. He dove to the ground, taking cover behind a nearby control panel. Zalira was faster. She was already up against the wall, her weapon drawn, her focus unwavering. In a flash, she fired at the soldiers, her shots precise and deadly. 3 of them fell before they could even react. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover, but Zalira's next shot sent them both crashing to the floor. Jack watched in awe as she moved with deadly efficiency. The Zalira he remembered had been fierce, yes, but this was something else. This was a woman who had been forged by the harshest of conditions, a woman who had been shaped by war and pain. And yet, she was still here, still fighting, not for the Zaltrax, but for herself. "You can't keep this up," Jack called out as he crouched behind the panel, scanning for more soldiers. "We need to move now." Zalira didn't even look at him. She was already reloading, her expression as cold as steel. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice flat. "If we stay here, we're dead." Without another word, she moved forward, her weapon raised, her steps measured. Jack followed, his pulse racing, the adrenaline surging through his veins. They moved quickly, weaving in and out of the shadows, staying just ahead of the enemy. But with each passing moment, it became clearer that they were being hunted. The Zaltrax soldiers were relentless, and it wouldn't be long before they were cornered. As they neared the docking bay, Jack could hear the sound of engines, a heavy mechanical hum that filled the air. The Zaltrax were preparing to leave to take control of the station. They couldn't let that happen. If they did, there would be no escape. "Zalira," Jack said, his voice strained, "we have to get to the ship before they do." Zalira didn't respond, but Jack could see the determination in her eyes. She knew exactly what was at stake. They both did. If they didn't get out of there, they were done for. There would be no more chances. The docking bay was just ahead, the massive door in front of them slowly opening to reveal the Zaltrax warships that lined the bay. Jack's heart sank. There were too many ships, too many soldiers. It would be impossible to break through. But Zalira was already moving, her pace quickening as she approached the nearest vessel. Jack followed, keeping his eyes on the soldiers that guarded the area. He could see them scanning the area, their weapons drawn, ready for any sign of movement. If they were seen now, there would be no hope. Zalira reached the ship's entrance, her fingers flying over the control panel. She worked quickly, the sound of her actions blending with the background noise of the station. Jack stood just behind her, his body tense, ready to fight if they were discovered. The door opened with a soft hiss and Zalira stepped inside, motioning for Jack to follow. He didn't hesitate. They were out of time. Inside the ship, everything was dark and quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the engines powering up, the vibrations running through the metal floor. Jack and Zalira made their way through the narrow corridors of the vessel, moving swiftly and silently. They didn't have the luxury of being subtle anymore. They needed to get to the cockpit, to take control of the ship before the Zaltrax could realize what had happened. But as they moved deeper into the ship, the weight of their situation began to settle on Jack. This was it. They were running out of time. The Zaltrax would soon realize that their mission had been compromised, and when that happened, they would stop at nothing to bring them down. They reached the cockpit, and Zalira immediately began working on the controls. Her hands were steady, but Jack could see the strain in her eyes. She was exhausted, but she didn't show it. She was a soldier, and soldiers didn't stop until the mission was over. "Can you get us out of here?" Jack asked, his voice tight with the weight of their situation. Zalira glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I can," she said simply, "but we won't be safe until we're off the station, and even then the Zaltrax will come for us." Jack nodded, understanding the reality of the situation, but there was no turning back now. There was only forward. With a final press of a button, the ship's engines roared to life, and they were off. The station grew smaller and smaller as they sped away, leaving behind the chaos and the enemies that had once been their foes. Jack didn't know where they were headed, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. But as the ship tore through the void of space, heading toward the unknown, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The Zaltrax would not give up so easily. They would chase them, track them, and eventually catch up. And when that happened, Jack knew there would be no more running. The stars outside the viewport were a blur, the ship's engines humming steadily beneath Jack's feet as they sped through the vast emptiness of space. The station they had escaped was now a distant memory, a dying world fading behind them. Jack's gaze was fixed on the endless stretch of stars ahead, but his mind kept wandering back to what had just happened. The chaos, the soldiers, the fact that they had made it out. Zalira sat in the pilot's seat, her hands steady on the controls as the ship cruised through space. She didn't look tired, but Jack knew better. The exhaustion was there, hidden behind the calm facade she had built up over the years. She had saved them both, just like she had always known how to survive, but the weight of everything, the war, the betrayal, the decisions she had made, was taking its toll. Jack walked over to the console beside her, his boots thudding softly on the metal floor. He didn't know what to say or even if he should say anything. The silence between them was comfortable, though heavy. They had both come a long way in the last few hours. Too much had happened, and the journey wasn't over. "We're not out of danger yet," Zalira said suddenly, her voice low, almost to herself. Her fingers moved expertly over the controls as she adjusted their course, guiding the ship further into the black void. Jack didn't need to ask what she meant. The Zaltrax forces would be hunting them. He could feel it in his gut. Their ship wasn't equipped for a prolonged chase. They were barely a speck in the galaxy, and the Zaltrax would send everything they had to bring them down. "I know," Jack replied, his voice quiet but firm. He stood beside her, his gaze now focused on the star systems passing by, each one a new possibility. "But we've bought ourselves some time. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Zalira gave a small nod, but her eyes didn't leave the controls. She was trying to focus, to push away the gnawing doubts that had crept into her mind. The guilt, the fear. She had spent so many years in the service of the Zaltrax, her actions dictated by orders, by a war she hadn't started but had been forced to fight. And now she was on the run with Jack, the man she had once loved, and the only thing she knew for sure was that the path ahead was uncertain. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the cabin, the steady rhythm of the ship carrying them deeper into the unknown. Jack's mind was racing, thinking of everything that had happened, everything that still needed to happen. They needed a plan. They needed allies. They needed time, but time was the one thing they didn't have. The Zaltrax were relentless. "Where are we going?" Jack asked after a long pause, his voice breaking the silence. He wasn't asking for a destination. He was asking for a direction, some sense of purpose, something they could hold on to. Zalira's eyes flickered for a moment, then softened. "There's a planet I know, far off the beaten path. The Zaltrax don't bother with it. It's remote, isolated." "A good place to lay low for a while," Jack's brow furrowed. "And you think they won't find us?" She shook her head, the faintest hint of a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not saying they won't look, but they won't find us easily, not there. It's not a place anyone thinks to look." Jack leaned against the side of the cockpit, his eyes scanning her face. "How do you know so much about it?" Zalira hesitated, her hands still working at the controls, guiding the ship through space with practiced ease. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "I used to go there. It was a place I could disappear, a place to breathe before everything changed." The silence stretched between them again. This time it felt heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken words, of past lives that could never be reclaimed. Jack understood. He understood more than she probably realized. They had both been broken by the war, and they had both lost something along the way. But maybe, just maybe, they could find something here, a chance, a future, something to hold on to in the midst of all this chaos. "Okay," Jack said finally, breaking the silence. "Let's go there. If it's the best chance we've got, then that's where we'll head." Zalira nodded, her face unreadable as she adjusted their trajectory, the soft hum of the engines filling the air. "We'll get there in a few hours. We'll lay low, see what we can find, maybe even send out a signal for help, but we can't stay in one place for too long." We can't afford to, Jack understood. They couldn't let their guard down, not even for a moment. He didn't know what they would find on this planet or if anyone would be willing to help them. But the idea of a safe place, even if just for a little while, was enough to keep hope alive. For the next few hours, the two of them worked in silence. Zelira piloted the ship, her focus unwavering as she kept them on course. Jack checked their supplies, making sure they had enough food and water to last them until they reached their destination. He also set up a few communication channels, hoping to find some way to contact anyone who might be able to help. As they neared the planet, Jack's eyes flicked to the viewport. The planet loomed ahead, a distant blue orb against the dark backdrop of space. It looked peaceful, serene, almost like a dream, but Jack knew better. He knew that nothing about this situation was peaceful. Nothing about the life they were now living would ever be the same. "We're almost there," Zelira said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She glanced at him, her eyes flickering with a hint of uncertainty. "You ready for this?" Jack didn't know how to answer. He didn't know if he was ready for anything, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far, fought too hard. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, let's do this." The ship descended through the planet's atmosphere, the hull groaning under the pressure. Zelira's hands worked swiftly, adjusting the controls to keep them steady as they neared the surface. The landscape below them was barren, dotted with rocky hills and sparse vegetation. It was the perfect place to hide, a place where no one would come looking unless they knew exactly where to look. They landed with a soft thud, the ship's engines powering down as they touched the ground. For a moment, everything was still. The world outside was silent, the air heavy with the scent of dust and earth. Jack stood up, stretching his legs. He glanced at Zelira, who was already standing, her eyes scanning the area outside. "This is it," she said quietly. "We're here." Jack nodded, the weight of their situation sinking in. They were on a strange world, far from everything they had known, with nothing but each other and the small hope that they could find some way to survive. But the future was uncertain. The Zaltrax would never stop hunting them, and even if they survived, there was no guarantee of peace. But in this moment, as he stood beside Zelira, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of a new beginning. As they walked out of the ship and into the unknown, Jack knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and that, at least, was enough.